Signori merhaba, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome everyone and our distinguished guests from the Serpentine Galleries Council, and thank you all for joining us this morning in Valletta for the next lap of the MICAS International Art Weekend for our art talks. MICAS and the Serpentine Galleries are very proud to present these two sessions of talks inspired by the research and practice of artist Pierre Huyghe on the occasion of the unveiling of his wonderful work, Exomind Deep Water in Malta. I would like to welcome our co-chairs from the Serpentine Galleries, Ulrich Obrist, Artistic Director, and Rebecca Lewin, Curator of Exhibitions and Designs. I would also like to give a very warm welcome to all our speakers who come from different disciplines: philosophy, science, anthropology, art, and ecology. And I would like now to invite Hans Ulrich to introduce the first session, Bio-entanglement and dislocation.
And good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the first of two sessions. We are very happy you're here, and we are particularly happy about the continuation of this partnership between MICAS and the Serpentine Galleries. We think that MICAS plus Serpentine is 1 + 1 = at least 11. We were very excited to be here last time and discover the amazing artistic activities on the island, see the wonderful project you did with Ugo Rondinoni, and of course very delighted to have this year the Pierre Huyghe project as a direct collaboration between London and Malta. And the other day I was told that actually the connection between London and Los Angeles is called Lola, so we could call the connection between London and Malta Loma. Maybe, or something like that. But in a way, Pierre Huyghe was excited when we told him that, because he was always interested in this idea of going outside, also the museum, and also interested in this idea of actually creating new forms of public. He is interested in this idea, of course, we'll talk about that much, much more, that art becomes a living organism, one of the big themes we're going to discuss today. So we are deeply grateful to Pierre for his generosity and his extraordinary thinking, which makes everything possible. We are deeply grateful to Francis Sultana, who of course is at the origin of this Malta miracle with Phyllis Muscat and everybody else in the team who make it happen. And we are of course very grateful to our council, the Serpentine Council, and deeply grateful to Elena Foster for giving such a vision to the council, and to Norman and Elena Foster also, of course, for being here and for their vision to actually make the publication possible about which we're going to talk. We're also deeply grateful to Maya Hoffman, who is here, and the Luma Foundation, because this project actually is a partnership between the Serpentine and Luma in Arles, and we hope that you all can come. So it's actually a triangle. It's London, Malta, Arles, where the Pierre Huyghe exhibition will open in May, and we hope you can all come to Arles in the south of France for the big Luma opening in May. All of that is also explained in the publication. We are deeply grateful to the Serpentine Council, who makes possible all our work, and of course to the dream team of the Serpentine who is here. I'd like to thank Rebecca Lewin, who is the co-curator of the exhibition. I'd like to thank also Monica Variale, Antonia Grosse, and all our other teams who are here. We are grateful also to Koenig Books, who are the publisher, and we are also very grateful to Natalia Grabowska, who is here, somewhere in the room. Natalia, where are you? Here is Natalia Grabowska, who is also co-curator of this exhibition. Now, the book and the conference here really will focus on these amazing bodies of work Pierre has developed, which are for the first time really documented in this publication. It's The Host and the Cloud, which took place in a former museum in Paris. It's Untilt, which was developed during Documenta in Kassel. And it is also Afterlife Ahead, which was actually conceived for the Skulpturprojekte in Münster. And then, of course, last but not least, it was UUmwelt in 2018, the exhibition at the Serpentine. Before handing over to Simone Borg, to Mantia Diawara, and to Flora Katz, I just wanted to say a few more things about the context of this exhibition, because it really is inscribed in what we do at the Serpentine with new experiments in art and new experiments in art and technology. And these new experiments in art and technology are building, of course, on what Billy Kluwer in the 1960s did when he actually developed these extraordinary projects where he brought artists and engineers together. And it's something we feel is important for our time to do again. Given the complexity of technologies, we need new alliances, new forms of collaboration. And for this very reason, of course, we need such collaborations as Pierre Huyghe with a scientific laboratory in Japan, which made this entire exhibition possible. In the introduction to the second edition of his book, Understanding Media, Marshall McLuhan noted the ability of art to anticipate future social and also technological development. Art is an early alarm system pointing us to new developments in times ahead and allowing us to prepare to cope with them. Art as a radar environment takes on the function of indispensable perceptual training. That's what McLuhan said in the 60s, and I think that's very much true for what we see today. Namjoon Paik is a good example. At the time of McLuhan, he built his robot K456 and actually challenged the passive consumption of technology by the viewer, worked with global live satellites, and of course the Pikes of our time, like Pierre Huyghe, are now working with digital images, and as we will see later today, also with artificial intelligence. The reason to look closely at AI is that two of the most important questions of today are: how capable will AI become, and what dangers may arise from it? Its early applications already influence our everyday lives in ways that are more or less recognizable. There is an increasing impact on many aspects of our society, but whether this might be in general beneficial or malign for society is still uncertain. Artists are following these developments very closely. They are articulating, of course, also doubts about the promises of AI and reminding us not to associate the term artificial intelligence solely with positive outcomes. To the current discussions of AI, the artists contribute their specific perspectives and notably their focus on questions of image making. Now, it is interesting that, of course, I grew up in Switzerland, so one of the first artists I came across was, of course, the visionary Paul Klee. And Paul Klee often talked about art as making the invisible visible. And that, of course, is very relevant for today, because today we are surrounded by technology, we are surrounded by these devices, we are surrounded by algorithms which are in most parts working invisibly. They are working in the background, they, we can say remain inaccessible in the systems we use daily, but lately there has been an interesting comeback of visuality in machine learning. The ways that the deep learning algorithms of AI are processing data have been made visible through applications like Google's Deep Dream, in which the process of computerized patterns recognition is visualized in real time. And there are, of course, many other AI visualization programs that make the invisible visible. And that's really what Pierre did with his installation at the Serpentine. It was, I think, one of the very first time that a general public, we had almost 100,000 visitors to the exhibition, because free admission is the mantra of the Serpentine. We believe in this idea of art for all, in this idea that everybody should have access. So in this very visited exhibition, it was one of the first time that really people could somehow, visualize what this AI is. We read about it every day, but we can't really experience it. So, it somehow, Pierre created a more profound understanding, really, of what these images are. And it is fascinating, and that's the last thing I wanted to say before then handing over to our first speaker, to Manthe Diawara. It is interesting also that actually Pierre was also the teacher, maybe, or mentor of a young artist called Ian Chang, whom we also showed at the Serpentine Gallery. And Ian Chang, of course, has done this exhibition in London, which is really an exhibition with a central nervous system. And it was a completely new experience for us, because for the first time we had moving image, and that's of course also true for Pierre's exhibition, which is not in a loop. Sort of basically, Ian and Pierre liberated moving image from the kind of prism of the loop, because so far when you have moving image, at a certain moment it always loops. And that might also explain why we very seldomly seen moving image pieces installed permanently. It's interesting, we see them in exhibitions, And it has actually improved a lot since the 90s. I always remember conversations with Jonas Mekas when he complained that cinema would only be shown in the basement, as an evening program. Since the 90s, we do have video and moving image installations in exhibitions, super central in biennales, but we very seldomly have them installed permanently in houses, and even less so in public squares. I've not really seen a video installation permanently installed as a public artwork in a public square. And that, of course, will all change. It will all change with artists, like Pierre, and actually many others in that generation. We're working with Jenna Sutela at the moment. She did a digital commission. That, again, is a piece which is permanently changing and evolving. And of course, these artists, as long as there is electricity, hopefully empowered by solar energy, as long as there is electricity, these works will never repeat. And that's the same, for Pierre's UUmwelt piece. Jenna Sutela's digital piece, which you can see online, which we just started, will never repeat. It will never be twice the same. And that opens extraordinary horizons, actually, for public art. It opens, imagine that you would have a moving image installation in a railway station or on a public square, where you pass by every day or every week, and whenever you pass by, you would see something else. That is an amazing potential, in a way, for the future. Now, today we're going to address many different aspects of Pierre's work, because as you will see in the book, it's a whole universe. It's a form of world making, as Pierre has developed. And it is fascinating when we started to think, about these. When we started to think about these talks, we felt that it would be nice to really show all the different aspects of Pierre's work and disentangle it. And I think, are we starting with Simone or are we starting with Mantia? What is better? Rebecca, what do you think?
You are first, but it's up to you.
Good. So I wanted to introduce Simone Borg, who started her trajectory as a diplomat with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1991, and then went on to head the Multilateral and Legal Affairs Department within the Ministry for the Environment. And that's, of course, a very important aspect of Pierre's work, is the environment, is ecology. We live in the age of mass extinction, as Elizabeth Colbert says, and art plays a very important role in resisting this mass extinction. It's one of the key themes for us for this conference. So we're very delighted that Simone is here. Simone also was Malta's chief negotiator in international environmental multilateral agreements from 1991 to 2004, where she drafted national environmental law and policy. She coordinated the transposition of the environmental acquis communautaire before the EU membership, and during Malta's tenure of the presidency of the European Council, as Malta's head of delegation, she chaired the EU group on climate negotiations. And we are particularly happy, of course, that Simone Borg is here today, because also Pierre still has this dream, this very environmental dream, to one day have actually an island. And it was actually in that very first conversation we had in London with the delegation from Malta, with Francis Sultana, who is, of course, the great ambassador, with Jana Peel, who initiated it, and with you, that Pierre came up with this idea to actually, he came up with this wonderful idea to have an island somewhere where an artwork could evolve, for the next 100 years or 200 years, and would be almost like its own biological system. So all of that brings us really to you and the environment. Please give a very warm welcome to Simone Borg.
Thank you very much. I think you're all hearing me? Yes. It's a pleasure to be here, and I must admit that when I was invited to, as a speaker to this event, I was very nervous, because it's not my usual audience. You are not my usual audience. Between the academia and diplomacy, I've been involved in the climate negotiations for 30 years, which themselves have been very laborious. And so I said, if I could manage that, I think I should just share my experience. And when I was introduced to Pierre's work, I think I couldn't find more, I couldn't dovetail his work more than what I could see with my day-to-day work in trying to bring together on a national level, EU level, and even at the international level, the various disciplines to work towards the biggest challenge that humanity is facing right now, and that is climate change. And as you were talking as well, when you said art makes the invisible visible, when yesterday I saw the sculpture, the statue, I was impressed with the pregnant meaning that the statue conveys, especially in defining where is humanity at this point in time, both in dealing with climate change, but even in dealing with artificial intelligence, and with having brought about the era of the Anthropocene. In fact, we acknowledge that we live in the Anthropocene era nowadays because humanity is in a position to change even nature. It is leaving a mark which at this moment it's the most powerful species, leaving a mark. But at the same time, humanity is also realizing that this knowledge base that it has gathered over centuries is going to be probably replaced by artificial intelligence or competing with artificial intelligence. And at the same time, this knowledge base is also making it aware of its precarious situation, of the challenges it has to face in having wreaked havoc on nature, that nature is nowadays taking maybe its vengeance on it, and the fact that humanity has foraged and used resources so carelessly, it has led to this new challenge of climate change, something which humanity has never had to deal with before. But at the same time, it is the knowledge that has made humanity aware that it's at this point at a crossroads in time. So I think when looking at the statue and you look at this humanoid form, almost like a grown child somehow, which represents perhaps our youth and our young generation that are taking such a prominent role at this point in time in really stressing on the need for governments to take action on climate. And the form is also looking, it's as if it's lost something and it's feeling its way about on the ground in contact with the earth that generated it. And yet at the same time it seems to have lost its relationship with the earth. It's as if there's something there's a gap between the earth and the child. And above all, I was obviously, like all of you, I guess, particularly impressed with the oversized head, which is a beehive. And the concept of the beehive. So there are so many aspects which link it to what is the situation nowadays with humanity, how it is being displaced, perhaps, because of its own making, because of its own recklessness. And definitely the bee, which is, first of all, a social animal like humanity, like humans, is really a lesson to us all in how it manages to be resilient because it works in a community, because it is selfless. Despite the hierarchy of the queen, the worker bee, and the drone, they have a different role, but each and every one of them is ready to live for the other and make way for a new generation without disrupting the wealth of the hive, the beauty of the inter- and intragenerational association between the species. And above all, I think it reminded me of many expressions, bee in your bonnet, as busy as a bee, the sense of the hive, which is where you have a knowledge base of how the hive is built even the way the hive is built. I remember when I used to have my biology classes many years ago, the construction of the hive itself is in a manner which does not allow leakages and waste of honey, which is the living nectar that maintains the community. And this is a lesson perhaps to humanity that has been so wasteful over time and has generated this problem of climate change. And the concept of the bee being busy and voracious, but never wasteful, and always with a purpose, and living in constant symbiosis with nature, in cross-fertilization of the species of flowers and the pollination process, etc. I also think that the artist shows us there also the responsibility that humanity faces at this point in time, that knowledge is there for a purpose, and that humanity, that knowledge has brought us in contact with the reality that although we're perhaps at the top of the pyramid, that we are orchestrating the Anthropocene, but yet really and truly we're just one of the many species in the whole circle of life. And we can be displaced, will probably be displaced. And what kind of responsibility do we have today to be able to remain in a harmonious relationship with nature and with what we've managed to create, which is this knowledge base, this artificial intelligence? I think it's the question that the artist maybe wishes to ask in the statue, of trying to find something around it. It will be actually up to us, up to our selflessness as a generation at this point in time, up to our selflessness as the various sectors that have various interests today that need to be matched with the requirements of the future generations. And yes, why not to accept this with a lot of humility, that we are part of nature and we should be respectful for nature, and whatever will happen to humanity is simply an act of selflessness that passes on the baton, as the bees do, every generation, one after the other. And when we have used up all our potential, we make way for another generation that will continue with the function that to keep the hive alive. I think these philosophical thoughts of mine, linked to my experience with my work, is I tried to translate what all this hype about climate change is about. It's a reality, it is an action that we as a race have to be protagonists, but it's also a responsibility on the present generation, from the men in the street to the heads of government, to understand what kind of changes do we need to make in our daily lives in order to make sure that we neither compromise future generations of humans, but also, and especially, we keep the planet alive in all its forms and diversity. I hope that that has contributed in some way to bridge the two aspects.
Thank you so much. And indeed, it's a very important point, because that was actually the conversation which happened when the delegation from Malta visited us, in London, and we had the ministry and of course Francis Sultana, and it was the exhibition, and we were looking at the exhibition. We were discussing how to basically bring Pierre to Malta, and there are so many possibilities, and we all felt immediately that the ecological impact, the environmental aspect of his work is the most important thing. We could emphasize more than any other of the aspects. And of course, one of the goals really in the face of the ecological catastrophe and extinction should be to establish new forms of ecological intelligence rooted in imagination, empathy, and attentiveness. And I think a lot of that, what you said, shows the important role art can play within that. And that, of course, leads us right away to Flora Katz, who has for many, many years worked very closely with Pierre Huyghe. I would say that no one at this point knows Pierre's work better than Flora, because Flora literally spent many, many, many months in Pierre's studio, scanning, digitizing, because Pierre has a kind of a atlas. It's a bit like an image fundus, and he always draws images from this atlas, and his drawings and photographs, and no one has really had access to this atlas. It's almost like a secret atlas of his ideas, but Flora had full access and has photographed and scanned all of these, different elements. Flora is an art critic, a curator, a PhD student at Université Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, and her research revolves around speculative realism, philosophies in contemporary art, something, of course, Pierre is very interested in. Flora has worked at the Centre Pompidou, also at the Béton Salon, at Miguel Abreu Gallery. Please give a very warm welcome to Flora Katz.
All right.
Thank you very much. So I will show you some images. We can situate the work Exomind, which is just now on view, inside the context of a large body of work that Pierre Huyghe has been developing for the past 10 years. And what makes Pierre Huyghe such a key artist today is that actually the form of this work is very special, and is changing the conception, the general conception that we have of an artwork. So we usually think about an artwork as a static and a fixed object. This object lies inside a museum and is waiting to be seen by visitors. So traditionally, we have a subject looking at a non-living object. But modernity, about 100 years ago, is the beginning of the critique of this tradition. So the critique, for instance, of a painting as a figurative work, and where a painting wouldn't be exactly an image of reality. It's the beginning of abstraction, let's say like 100 years ago. And then also, but also as well, sculpture, which starts little by little to leave behind the pedestal. And here, so I chose like a few images. You can see on the top left, it's Auguste Rodin just seen as a traditional sculpture, well, on a pedestal. And then just down Constantin Brancusi, where the pedestal starts to dialogue with the figure, and there is an uncertainty about it. And then slowly, the sculpture will extend horizontally inside the museum and also will go out. So we have two examples here, Robert Smithson, which we call an artist of land art. Here is the spiral jetty. And Daniel Buren, who's a French artist who has created this concept of in situ work, which is a situated artwork, and these vertical lines are invading here. So you see haystacks, but it can be also inside cities. And so, next slide. Here also is another work at the end of the 70s, and it kind of made me think about Exomind. That's also why I wanted to show it here. So it's by Marimis. And the next slide. So here you can see it's actually a pond. It was the piece Exomind was first installed in Japan. So what we can say is that Pierre Huyghe doesn't really produce static objects. And recently, we have started calling them complex systems or ecosystem. Next slide. So this is here a drawing, a preparatory drawing for the work that is just after, the next slides, which is called After Life Ahead. Yes, next slide, here. And as you can see, it is in a former ice rink, and you have a multiplicity of elements which are co-evolving in a space. And it can be, here it's an abandoned space, it's a former ice ring, but it can also be, so the next slide you have three images here, so Untilled, which has a sculpture that's slightly resembling to Exomind. And this happens in a compost, so also kind of an abandoned space. And not only outside of the institution, but at least elements which could escape the institution. So in the work UUmwelt that was presented at the Serpentine last year, you had flies, and the flies, of course, will be able to escape the white cube and the box of the institution. So what is a complex system? Next slide. It can be as well, Wikipedia is a complex system, a society is a complex system, and an embryo as well is a complex system. So it's both living or non-living entities. The idea is that it's a multiplicity of elements which are interacting together, and we cannot predict the outcome of it. That's what makes the difference between a system, which is closed, and a complex system. What is important here in this piece, that we understand also that a complex system, in difference with an ecosystem, would entangle not just live elements, but also non-alive elements, such as, he's also playing on the notion of life, because here on the bottom left, you have a cancer cell variator, so cells of cancer which are evolving, and these cancer cells trigger the opening of sort of a window that you can see on the top, and so on and so on. As you can see, it's a constant entanglement of elements which are changing altogether. Next slide. So what matters for Huyghe, as we can see here in some preparatory notes, is that the exhibition becomes sort of alive. So on the top, he asks, can an exhibition live? Can it even be ill, die, reproduce? Can it parent, offspring? Isn't that such a weird question about the artwork? Aren't we so far away from the painting or the sculpture? This is what he's thinking about when he's creating Afterlife Ahead, or UUmwelt, or Untilled. And he says he uses living as a motor for permanent change, which means, you said, it's going out of the loop, but not exactly, we'll see why. But from what we understand here is that the artwork is not anymore a fixed object. It composes a whole which is co-evolving and generates also itself endlessly. In the two images down, these are the schematics, the diagram that he is producing for one work. It's a living cancer variator. It's just a piece that's slightly similar to Afterlife Ahead. And he writes on the image on the right, feedback. And there is this form of a loop, actually, that you can see in the work. And it's kind of important, because the work composes a cycle in a feedback loops, which means that in Afterlife Ahead, it is slightly changing, co-evolving, but it is also repeating. The windows open and close, the living cancer variator evolve, and it is actually also characteristic of the Earth. In a recent conference, the philosopher Bruno Latour talked about Gaia. So what is Gaia? It's a part of the Earth. It's a part of the Earth which is changing constantly, metamorphic part. And Bruno Latour explains that Gaia functions as a feedback loop with all the entity inhabiting the planet. And they are, whatever we do, we're constantly tied together. There is not anymore a landscape with characters on it, but it's a complex system of entity. And hence the works of Huyghe can echo the complex processes that we are facing today as climate change. You've heard of retroaction or feedback loop when we talk about climate change, actually, such as greenhouse gas. It's a long-term action that comes back in a feedback from the action of, since the Industrial Revolution. So the work Exomind was first produced in Japan in 2017, and it is also quite similar to Untitled, which was produced in 2011 and 2012 for the Documenta. And there is a lot of similarities, so I just wanted to say two things about it. So Untitled lies in a space that echoes the riparian environment of Exomind. Because Untitled was created in a compost, which acts again as this intense feedback loop, because everything that would go in the ground would also transform. You can have next slide where you see different elements that are lying in that compost. So you have remnants of culture that are present, but also just pheromones, plants. There is, you can see, a dog with a pink paw, and the sculpture Legend of Fauna, which is as well a replica of an existing sculpture. So again, we have this feedback that is, but what is important is that the elements are not creation per se, but a repetition and a recycling of existing works. But what is important is to know just not things that when they are repeating and exactly the same, but when they transform. That's important. The moment when the loop can deviate and change. So two last things that I could say in the... So here, these are notes that were written just preparing Untitled. And you can see on the left, he writes rhythm and timing. It's a choreography of elements. Pierre Huyghe inserts times and rhythm inside the work. And these rhythms are not dependent on him. There's a dog, there was a turtle, but it left. And there is a cat, actually, as well, in Japan. I guess it left as well. But the bees, what is important is that the bees, they are, it's a pattern. They are constantly coming back as well. So Pierre Huyghe wanted to see how these bees will change a little bit their behavior. And you see the square and how the bees go out of the square. So we come back to how the artwork gets out of the frame that humans have created and how the artwork self-produces and gets also kind of, well, freed from the hand of the artists here. Entanglement just of not only non-living but also living, and as well fiction and reality. And it's important because it foresees as well the work of Pierre Huyghe after it was artificial intelligence. Because if we try to get out of this box of separation between reality and fiction or virtual and actual, complex system is a kind of a proper image for understanding that whatever we think or imagine or whatever we do, nothing can be completely separated. Everything gets constantly recycled and always comes back at the end. So I hope I gave you a little bit of background in the work.
Thank you so much.
Great.
In the book, you will find a very long interview alongside a text, of course, by Dorothea von Hantelmann, a long interview which happened, during the build-up of the show, where Pierre also talks about the bees. He talks about very much about what you can see here in Malta, but he also talks about what you addressed in your speech, this very important point, really, of it being a living organisms. And I just wanted to add this quote here: living organisms are stones change. It's a question of temporal scale, says Pierre, which is not something that can always be experienced, but must be understood outside our experience of it. On the other hand, time-based situations addressed to us exist within a time frame that remains hysterical, in the sense that it is intentionally driven, destined for the event, the moment of exhibition, when things are supposed to happen for the gaze of the visitor. To escape this condition, it necessitates a degree of indifference, a disruption of causality, a shift in meaning, incompleteness, weakness, and oddity. End of quote. And of course, what Pierre means here, and I think it is what you so wonderfully fleshed out in your presentation, is this idea that it really goes beyond the exhibition. Because if you think about sustainability, if you think about the current moment in the world of mass extinction, what does event culture mean? And I think there is an extraordinary movement right now. I was just yesterday, in New York for the opening of the new Museum of Modern Art, and there is, among many amazing things, this new commission of Philippe Parreno, who now no longer uses the word exhibition, he calls it a manifestation. And I think the same thing is, in a very different way, true for Pierre. These living organisms, what you've been describing to us about Münster and Kassel and the dog, go beyond the time frame of the hysteria of the event. We don't need the hysteria of the event. And that brings us right away to Mantia Diawara, because among the many collaborations with Mantia, we worked on an exhibition actually at the De Linen Foundation together in Belgium, together with David Hammonds. It was a collaboration curated of Mantia and David Hammonds of an extraordinary exquisite corpse, which is really the opposite of a hysterical event. It is something which grew over a lifetime, slowly and organically. Mantia was born in Mali, West Africa, is a distinguished professor of comparative literature and film at New York University. Was actually educated in Guinea-Conakry, in Bamako, before migrating to the United States. He's a prolific writer and filmmaker. His essays on art, cinema, and politics have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, in the LA Times, and he's the author, of course, of very acclaimed memoirs, In Search of Africa, which is published by Harvard, and We Won't Budge, which is an African in the World in 2008, and has published many, many essays. We met actually at the 80th anniversary of Édouard Glissant in Paris, because the great Édouard Glissant, whom I always consider to be the most important thinker for our time, who said he passed away a few years, but his thinking only becomes more relevant by the hour, his ideas of mondialité, and he connects, of course, deeply to the theme we are discussing here today, because Édouard Glissant said that we live in an age of globalization. It is not the first time the world experiences globalization. You have globalization during the Roman Empire, but it is certainly the most extreme or violent form of globalization the world has ever experienced. So Glissant said that that leads to homogenizing forces and ultimately to extinction. Extinction of species, extinction of languages, extinction of cultural phenomena, all aspects Mantia has addressed in his work for many years. But Glissant said at the same time, we also need to be aware that there will be he said in the 70s, there is a counter-reaction to this globalization, and that's new forms of nationalism, new forms of lack of tolerance, new forms of localism, new forms of racism, which of course has to be resisted vehemently. So that's why Glissant talked about mondialité, a global dialogue which would not be homogenizing and would not lead us to extinction. So you must imagine we are at the 80th anniversary of Édouard Glissant, and there are probably about 200 people in the room, and Édouard basically takes my hand and says, I now must bring you to Mantia Diawara. This is the most urgent thing tonight, because something amazing will happen. And we are eternally grateful. I am eternally grateful to Édouard, and of course to Mantia, that Mantia is here today. A very warm welcome to Mantia Diawara.
Thank you. Thank you. Merci, mon frère. I'd like to thank also Georgina and Rebecca for keeping up with me and my very erratic ways of responding on emails and all these things. So thank you very much. I appreciate whatever you did to get me here. I've read, I kind of don't like my voice in the mic, but I put up with it. I have read reviews of Pierre Huyghe's work, LACMA, Japan, Serpentine. But last night was the first time I experienced the work in situ. And I experienced it in situ in a context that was extraordinary, because it was in the darkness. First, they told us that it was closed. We couldn't see it. We had to see it today in the light. But then they led us through the aqueduct in a jungle, and then we saw the peace in that. And of course, Hans Ulrich has been talking about this. This brings up Glissant's point that there is opacity in the dark, but there is also opacity in the light. So this is important to me because experiencing the sculpture in the dark, and people had their cell phones lighting it every once in a while, getting closer to it. What it brought to my mind, I'm gonna say African, but it really is universal. Because it was the first time you could see the person and its double or their double. I think in the US we use they nowadays more than anything. So a person and their double together. Usually we all have doubles. A doubles could be a tree, a doubles could be bees, and they separate, they work on our intuitions, they do whatever they do, but to bring you and your double together, the bees and the sculpture was fascinating to me, but it was also scary because it's dangerous, it is visual, and I was pretty taken by it and thought about it a lot last night. Because what we are doing, we're killing our doubles. And by killing our doubles, we will eventually kill ourselves. You could see this in many poems. Again, I would say Africa, but all around the world. You could see somebody like the Négritude poet, Birago Diop, who will say, écoute plus souvent les choses que les êtres. La voix du feu s'entend, entend la voix de l'eau. And then he began to say, listen to things more often than human beings. And then the voice of this, the wind's voice can be heard, the water's voice can be heard. So the piece was bringing those echoes to my mind. I decided, therefore, to try to invoke Glissant's notions of trembling, la pensée de tremblement, a work that I did for the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. They were doing this thing called soft thought. I think you know about this. And because you have to tremble, the poem that I just cited says that you have to listen, but Edouard Glissant says you have to tremble. You have to tremble with the trembling of other things. And by la pensée du tremblement, which I call here the poetics of thinking, of trembling, translation is very bad because tremblement for Glissant is also a tremulous way of doing things, not going to things with a lot of certainty, going to things by hesitating. Tremblement is also a quakeful, like earthquakes, that you get to things. So bear with me, Glissant keeps reminding us that the world trembles physically, emotionally, and aesthetically, in the air, under the ground, and below the oceans. To tremble with the trembling of others is to develop the capacity to imagine oneself in another's place, to reject an injustice that is being visited upon them, and to be attuned to their aesthetic sensibilities, relating to them without assuming their voices or reducing their differences to our own. For Glissant, trembling thoughts may not instantly lead to the reparation or restitution demanded by some, but they prepare us for the hard work of coming together once we start exchanging our differences and trembling together. And Glissant says this, that the strong and unwavering thoughts would have remained sterile if they were not supported and sustained by the trembling thoughts of the one world in relation. Glissant's concept of the one world, or two mondes basically, demands that we share our coincidences, our good luck, and our serendipity says. I had a lot of difficulty translating this word in English. I traveled with it for a long time because Glissant always says, partageons nos hasards. And if he say, let's share our chances, it's true, but it's not. And then I was in Portugal once, and then somebody said, maybe one could also translate it as coincidence. And then I was one time at Tate Modern, somebody said, well, maybe we could call it, let's share our good lucks, you know. So, but serendipity is really what Glissant is trying to tell us here. How do we share our serendipities? Because I think the problem with not only that this sculpture is showing us, it's not only about bringing up the fact that, you know, the destruction of nature is coming out of man's greed and arrogance, but it's also because we're not sharing in many ways. We're not sharing nos hasards. We must share them knowing that, as Glissant put it, in the experience of the abyss, the absurd cruelty is most often visited upon humankind at the hands of other humankinds. The sharing of coincidences could prepare us not only for the healing process, but also for mobilizing humanity against recurrences of cruelty. No suffering is too big or too small to be shared with others. And as the knowledge of it goes from place to place, this knowledge gets stronger. And this was very important to Glissant. La connaissance voyage. Elle s'agrandit en voyageant. You know, and that's why he liked the concept of relay, like in Olympics. You know, he takes knowledge, he gives it to me, and I give it to you. And then, you know, like this kind of sculpture travels like that. This was very, very important to him. And then the result to Glissant, as Hans would say, is always unintended. He can't just bring things together like his notion of creolization and say, I will mix these things and they will produce this. Glissant is saying the result is always unintended. These unintended consequences were considered by Glissant as the first aesthetic elements of the coming together, not through power or hegemonic and financial domination, but through the poetics of relation, intuitive solidarity, and sharing of knowledge. Aware of the time, so let me just jump to what I think the sculpture is doing for us. Glissant basically thought that poetry and art were buried when we developed the philosophy, systematic ways of thinking. We thought that poetry was too opaque. Therefore, it can't really have a real systematic discussion with poetry. Therefore, let's kick it out of the République and then begin to discuss things that we could all understand. But Glissant said that opacité, actually, c'est ce qui garantit le divers. Opacity is what breeds and keeps alive the concept of diversity. But if we only have clarity, then we tolerate each other, but we don't really accept each other. This was very important to Glissant. For Glissant, poetry and art are the best means for getting at the truth and reassembling the differences of the chaos monde. The chaos monde was very interesting to him. Western rational and systematic thinking have buried the poem a long time ago as a reliable source of knowledge because it was considered too opaque and contaminated with unstable semantic connotation. It is precisely for its opacity that Glissant believed that art and poetry must be recitated. You can't just come to a sculpture like this, I want to understand it. It's maybe 10 years later, this sculpture will remind you of something, you know, and interrupt your everyday business. But if you want to understand it, then forget it. You know, if you have to apply it, you know, it's about environment, of course, but if you apply it, then you're missing Glissant. And so Glissant is precisely for this, its opacity that art and poetry must be resuscitated. And now, like Orpheus, we have to retrieve from the rubble of crumbling buildings the simulacrum of trompe-l'oeil of artificial intelligence and well-crafted stories. We have to search for them as if they were hiding, as if they were discarded armoires in the garbage dump, abandoned and forgotten in nature. Glissant's poetics of philosophy is about stopping time so that we all participate in resuscitating the artwork and the poem that we are trampling under our feet, the art and poetry we lost a long time ago. So let me skip quickly. Then he talks about the greatness of nation is now no longer measured by weapons, and he can never remind Trump of that sufficiently. You know, the greatness of nation comes from, no longer comes from their might, the exhibition of the military, economic, and technological valor. The world no longer functions with nations discovering, conquering, colonizing, and exploiting other nations. So they are not only great civilization, or to put it in another way, the very thing that we call civilization has given way to the entanglement, the enmeshing of these human cultures living in proximity of one another and in interdependence. Their details give birth to from everywhere the totality. Greatness is not even defined by the entitlement of first and last. I will spare you that. Let me quickly talk about intuition a little bit and how important it is. What is intuition for Glissant? It is a feeling equally distributed among beings and non-human. It is a flash of light in the mind, an inspiration that unexpectedly comes to illuminate our understanding of objects or an issue that was until then not present in the mind. When the imaginary, a fragment of an image or a nebulous concept takes shape or comes to fruition as an idea, it suddenly interrupts our daily routines and interferes with our normal way of thinking about and seeing the world. And intuition alerts us and urges us to approach reality in a new way. We must therefore work to connect our intuition together. And then Glissant has this very famous statement, and I just summarized that one and stopped there. He made the point that at any given moment in a room like this, we are thinking about something that we think is private to us, that only we know, that no one else knows. And Glissant's point is, it's actually being felt in Japan, everywhere in Africa, in Europe, at the same time. So our role is to share those intuition and create a solidarity of intuition, and that will really make this thing travel. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mattia. We are thinking to do Q&As now, but I think actually we should do a coffee break, and then maybe Rebecca will introduce then the second panel, and then maybe we can at the end have all the speakers for a discussion. I suddenly thought that that would somehow be more holistic, deeply grateful to the three wonderful speakers this morning. I think given the extinction crisis and the ecological crisis, what Pierre tells us, what you told us about this morning, has a lot to do with hope, and it actually made me think of Raymond Williams, who once said to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. So please give another big round of applause for our amazing three speakers. And we now have a 10-minute coffee break. And as we always say, the most important things often happen in the coffee breaks. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to introduce our second session of talks this morning, as you know, on the occasion of the unveiling of Pierre Huyghe's work, Exomind Deep Water, and introduce our second group of speakers who will be presenting their thoughts in response to Huyghe's work and in response to the title of this session. As we heard in the first session, the idea of entanglement, whether we apply it to quantum physics or whether we look at it in the movement of fish or in the perception of things that we can't even see, seems totally inextricably bound up in Pierre Huyghe's approach to making art. But we want to ask, what is it that's being entangled? What elements is he bringing together? And how does his work rely on their autonomy and interaction to turn his prototypes, his proposals for artworks, into something much more than an object, even a hyper-object? The title of this talk is inspired by Timothy Morton's The Ecological Thought, in which he explains the hyper-object as something massively distributed in time and space. Weather systems or even radioactivity are given as examples of this. This session will open up the consideration of Huyghe's practice beyond Exomind specifically, and consider the relationship between the materials in Huyghe's works that are technological or abiotic with the living and biological. At the Serpentine Gallery, as Ulrich mentioned in the first session, his exhibition UUmwelt used a deep neural network to attempt to reconstruct images as they were pictured in the mind of an individual, rather than being read by a camera or dictated by a human programming a particular software. These were, in effect, some of the closest attempts made to date to show us what an intercepted human thought might look like. And his aquariums, which have brought together extraordinary creatures, also do this, combining the living and the biological with the pre-programmed and the invisible. Looking back at his earlier work, Untilled, in an interview with Ulrich that is in the publication, Huyghe remarks, "Untilled is a hyper-object. As a living organism, it has its own development. It self-generates, grows, and diffuses in different realms." Although Morton's description of the hyperobject actually appeared after the generation of Untilled, we might say that this principle follows many of the larger scale works that Huyghe has produced since the early 2010s. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers. The first, we're going to go in this order. The first is Emanuele Coccia. Emanuele is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and formerly taught in Freiburg in Breisgau, Germany. He was invited professor at the Universities of Buenos Aires, Düsseldorf, Tokyo, and Weimar, and he was fellow at the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America at Columbia University in New York. He's worked extensively on aesthetics and on biology, and has written about contemporary art and fashion. I'm not going to go through a whole biography, but I'm really delighted to have you here, and I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you, Emanuele.
Sorry. Thank you so much for it. Exomind is not just an incredible piece of art, it's a treatise on interspecific biology. First of all, it's a plaidoyer for an overcoming of neurobiology. Mind, Pierre teaches, is not an organ, but it exists outside the body of every living individual. Mind is not a thing, it is a relationship. Mind doesn't exist in our body, but in the relationship that our body establishes with other bodies. But more importantly, if minds do not exist, or if minds do exist outside the body, it is because they are not a monospecific equipment of individuals. What we call mind is always an association between two species. Bees, for instance, embody the mind of the human being. This idea, which could be resumed in the formula, mind is not an organ, it is an ecology, is not at all extraneous to contemporary biology or ecology. The first one who proposed such a thesis was Paul Shepard in a book called Thinking Animals. Thought, he claimed, is the effect and not the condition of possibility of the symbiotic cohabitation between plants, animals, and bacteria, etc. It is only and always in the interspecific relationship that the great predators have developed their intelligence, Without the herbivores, for instance, the great carnivores predators would have been completely stupid. So the novelty, originality, and the geniality of Pierre's gestures lies first of all in the fact that he attributes for the first time the thesis of the interspecific nature of the mind to the human mind. So our mind does not depend on having a brain and a nervous system, but it exists within the body of a bunch of other individuals of different species and perhaps of different kingdoms that has literally colonized our heads. In a certain sense, the human body is a hyperobject composed by at least two species, and in a way is claiming that every species is a hyperobject. Also, that was the same idea also in the human mask, in the video. Secondly, Exomind states also that what we call art is nothing but the search for this mind always embodied in another species, or rather in the relationship with another species. Thanks to Pierre's work, our mind is now embodied by bees. It's not just the evidence of that, it's the production of this exteriorization of our mind. Vice versa, and perhaps more importantly, Pierre's gesture allows us to think that the interspecific relationship that we call mind, spirit, intelligence, or whatever, is not something natural, it is not spontaneous, eternal, purely biological, but it is a technical, artistical fact. So every relationship between species should be read not only as something contingent, but as something similar to the relationship between an artist and the piece of matter which she or he is manipulating. Or better, as the relationship between curator and artist. In the biological hypothesis of exominds, bees, as human minds, are the curators of humanity, which is very nice. Conversely, we would be an artistic installation of bees, a sort of biennial that has lasted for about 3,000 years. What this work hypothesizes is that the relationship between species is a logical and mental relationship and not purely material, but also a sort of artistic curatorial relationships. Now, I would like to try to draw all the consequences of this new theoretical and artistic gesture, what it means, or what does it mean to think that the mind is for each species embodied within the life of another species, and that therefore the relationship between the species is an artistic relationship. So let's start from the biological consequences, and then let's come to the artistic consequences. First of all, if we accept Pierre's hypothesis, evolution and natural selection are totally revolutionized. Fish, plants, chickens, bacteria, viruses, fungi, earths, no matter if they are big or extremely small, no matter which kingdom they belong to, all living beings are minds. And minds, not just for themselves, but they are the minds of other species. All living beings are able not only to change their environment and other species consciously, but they are able to change the destiny of other species. The world, if observed from this point of view, becomes the ever-changing result of this universal and cosmic intelligence and sensitivity of infinite forms of life. Conversely, this cosmic mind is produced by an infinite series of meetings and arbitrary and rational decisions taken by different species at different times, following the most bizarre and strange intentions by each of them. Mind, that is, this interspecific evolution, is a result of hazardous encounters. Then, if each species is related to another species as its mind, that means not only that all evolutionary development is a co-evolution, to use the category that Peter Raven and Paul Ehrlich, long before Haraway, used, but also that co-evolution is what we normally call agriculture or breeding. Or if you like, agriculture becomes the transcendental form of any interspecific relationship. And from this point of view, the choice of bees is not a random one. If you think about it, the relationship between flowers and bees is that of a strange upside-down agriculture, in which flowers force bees to become their geneticists, to make decisions about their genetic destiny, because it is bees that decide who mates with whom, actually. The choice to put, so the flower had this very strange choice to put the destiny, the genetical or biological destiny of a species in the hands of another species. And the choice to put our minds in the life of bees, in this piece of art of Pierre, is analogous of the gesture of flowers. It is the gesture of putting our genetical destiny in the life of other species. And what is interesting in this fact is the fact that the decisions or the choices of bees concerning which flower has to mate with which other flowers is not based on a rational calculus, but on taste. It depends from how much sugar contains every flower. So evolution is based or would be based on taste and not on utility. So the sensitive taste of one species decides the fate of other species. That means that evolution is nothing but fashion within nature. It is a catwalk which is lasting millions of years, billions of years actually, where species let wear new clothing to other species. Each landscape is the equivalent of a contemporary art show or a fashion collection. Everything in nature is then artificial and arbitrary, but everything that is artificial through the agentivity of different species. So the history of Earth, the natural history of Earth, is a sort of extended form of art history, or this is a sort of everlasting art experiment. And what we call nature is just this kind of multi-specific art historical gallery, sort of multi-species biennial, an installation that is waiting to be replaced by hundreds of others. So in this sense, what we call natural world has the same status as art. So we could resume, in this sense, if we are applying this logic to all specific relationships, we could say that in a way, each species is both the artist and the curator of other species. And each species is both a work of art and a performance of the species of which it represents the evolution. So if we could resume this perspective by saying that art becomes, in Pierre's work, what should be called contemporary nature. So what does it mean? Let me explain. So from the beginning of the 20th century, I'm saying something which is extremely trivial. I'm a little bit ashamed to say that next to Ulrich, Rebecca, and Maya, but anyway. From the beginning of the 20th century, when art was established as an avant-garde, it's easy to fulfill an aesthetic function. It has been freed from the task of producing beauty, of decorating the existing, and bringing it to a form of harmony. By claiming to be contemporary, by claiming to embody a form of time and not a way of space or matter, art has become a collective practice of divination of the future. From that moment on, through art, every society builds something that does not yet exist within it. It is no longer an harmonious reflection of its own nature, but an attempt to reproduce itself differently from what it is. A way to be different and to know his different that does not yet exist. Contemporary art is, in a way, this sort of movement which allows culture to become different from what it is. So we must think of evolution, or Pierre let us think about evolution, that is art in nature, natural us, as the way of being of life that corresponds to what is contemporary art for culture. Nature is not only the immemorial prehistory of culture, but its future, not yet realized. It's surrealistic anticipation. Contemporary nature is the stage in which life, it is at the forefront of its future, its life as an avant-garde, natural avant-garde. So Pierre Pies invites us to reform, in a way, art museums, natural history museums, zoos, and botanical gardens, or perhaps to overcome their opposition, their division. If nature is an art historical biennial, we do not need white boxes anymore in order to see art. And conversely, if art is always a question of an interspecific relationship, so since our mind, our taste is always a decision on the destiny of the life of 1,000 other species, then art museums are also natural history museums. So the opposition on the separation of art museum and natural history museums continue to present the life and history of human and non-human as separated. So Exominds remind us that this opposition should not be accepted anymore. Pierre's piece of art is a plaidoyer for the foundation of a new kind of institution, so what we could call the Museum for Contemporary Nature, a sort of hybrid between old museums, zoos, or botanical gardens. In a way, this is the first embodiment of these new museums, which could be also the promoter of a sort of eco-surrealist culture, capable of imagining nature beyond its limit. Art itself is the practice of the production of an interspecific Leviathan. So, as you know, modern politics begins with the myth of a monster produced by an hyper-object, produced by the association of all the bodies of all the humans, the Leviathan. So the state is following Hobbes, nothing than this hyper-object. Pierre's work is a sort of interspecific Leviathan, a monster produced by the association of different species. Pierre's work and the new museums of contemporary nature that it embodies, it is the enterprise of the production of this new planetary Leviathan. Instead of thinking nature as what rises outside the city, nature has to become a part of a piece of art. And art becomes what makes possible the contemporaryity of nature. Nature is not the prehistory of art, it is its future, it is its mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuele. There are so many things to think about and respond to in that, which I promise you will at the end. But I think the main thing that I wanted to respond to immediately was, I think, our experience of working with Pierre inside a gallery space, which really required the whole of the Serpentine to become a museum of natural history, because there were, I think, we tried to count them up, but several 500,000 blue bottle flies over the course of his exhibition at the Serpentine were brought in, cared for, fed, and gathered together once they'd passed. But we became, in the course of that exhibition, very much caretakers and zookeepers in a way that is a complete shift for an institution which is more used to caring for objects that have to remain static as part of their nature. And the nature of these works were that they had to change and they had to be cared for and allowed to move and evolve and grow. And it does require a very different shift in thinking and in behavior on behalf of not just us as curators, but of the whole institution. So if that's our future, it's a very exciting one. I hope there's more of it. Thank you, Emanuele. Our next speaker will be Nora Khan. She is a writer. Her practice takes the form of criticism with a focus on digital visual culture and art that makes arguments through software, teaching, and a range of artistic collaborations, from opera librettos to installations. She's professor at Rhode Island School of Design in Digital and Media, where she teaches writing, experimental criticism, critical theory, and artistic research to graduate students. In digital media, graphic design, and industrial design. She's a long-time editor at Rhizome and currently prototype the book of Google's Artist and Machine Intelligence Group. And in 2020, she's a guest curator of an exhibition at The Shed, which is called Manual Override, which features Lynn Hirschman, Leeson, Sondra Perry, Simon Fujiwara, Marissa Nalari, and Martine Sims. Thank you so much, Nora.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you all for being here today. I wanted to do something a little bit different and tell a story about last night. Like Manthia, we all went down to see this work around 8 or 8:30 last evening. And in some ways, this was sort of a completely unexpected and perfect setting for seeing this confounding work. So we used the torchlights on our smartphones to navigate the path, and we had the moon above us and a general sense of the people around us, some new and some familiar. And we're walking with strangers in the shadows in a garden in the middle of the Mediterranean on the way to be open to a situation produced by a statue with bees in a clearing, something some of us had traveled a quarter of the way across the world to do so. So that frame alone was remarkable, turning us instantly to the construction of the situation and the art. And maybe we could move to the next slide. So heading to see this work, I had a few facts in hand. I thought of Exomind like this, that it would do away with all the constructs around an artwork and how it should be seen, but at a very specific setting imagined, partly controlled by Google Images, this clearing a figure experienced from a distance. And I imagined that we would stand in the clearing and watch the work and slow down our perception and let it work on us. And I came in with a lot of questions I needed answers to figure out the system that was being established. What plants were in this setting? What kind of trees? What was the temperature? How do the bees interact with the space? And what was the risk model? I was convinced I could get a sense of the invisible and interdependent system somehow through asking the right questions to determine a narrative about the space. And as a critic, these tools are pretty easily available. You keep asking questions about the thing not seen to form enough of a sense of the truth of a situation. But seeing it at night turned the situation completely upside down. Standing there watching the bees, almost still, we could fully feel the total indifference of the situation, of the bees and of the night, and of this interdependent system that would go on without us, that goes on without us, and that finds a way without us. So before making any analogs or metaphors about the thing, we had to take on this full encounter with indifference. So stumbling onto the clearing, maybe we could go to the next, thank you for moving this. Stumbling onto this woman and this being up close, it seemed more like a living thing we had interrupted, a figure which was twisting up from its crouch as though to hear us speaking. Instead of being able to see it from a distance and think about it from the edge of the space and keep a remove, we all had to be extremely unnaturally close to the figure, the statue, and the ecosystem. Some of us knelt down around it in a similar position, and so whether we were afraid of bees or not, the desire to try and see the system at work overrode that. And looking more closely, what looks still from a distance, the swarm actually reveals itself to be in pulsing movement, hundreds of twitches, tremblings, and gestures. We talked to the two beekeepers who were there, who told us about the buckfast bees replacing the Maltese bees, building and developing their structure, the carob trees and eucalyptus that would be pollinated, and what one could expect to happen over the next months. And staring at it, I almost forgot that there would be no visualization. I was somehow expecting lines and diagrams to emerge as a map over the situation. And I had to understand we weren't going to see the pollination, of course, or the ecosystem at work, but because we're so visually attuned and primed to see things as a culture, it was still extremely frustrating to not to get to see, even if that was the point. The rest of the night, and because of jet lag through this morning, I thought of how incredibly difficult it is to get rid of one's position and confront the indifferent up close here in the middle of the night, where our presence, other than the beekeepers, seemed totally unnecessary. We were a disturbance, an imposition, and this was almost pleasurable. After 20 minutes, the bees needed to be put to rest, and we needed to go and try and sort out meaning from this. So the discourse and the conversation for me first emerged from this space of encountering an indifferent unknown. So when we talk about intelligent systems, as other people have eloquently done today, systems that can exceed us, or in many ways like AI, a lot of theorists describe our need to have a similar radical embrace of indifference, of the systems of difference, in order to understand it as not being solely in relation to us. This position is described as more apt than binary framings of technology as a destructive force or something that will hurt us, but instead as a network that lives our values and inputs. And that's to say, our thinking through this situation can be seen as technologically inclined as well. The first step is some kind of sense of the thing cobbled together between research references found online, the art critical framework provided here by Dorothea von Hantelmann and Hans Ulrich in the book's essays, between the hundreds of Google images taken of this figure at many different angles in previous iterations in the forest of Japan. The figure is there seen from above at a comfortable remove and distance. The position is then shattered here, us brought down to the ground, crouching around it, trying to see the system at work and seeing nothing. So we turn to the beekeeper to understand more and hear their mediation. We could move to the next one. The beekeepers were really our guide here, telling us how they paint the queen bees different colors dependent on the season, how they know when the workers are restless and when they're about to be agitated, and when they are content. And as they told us of the invisible chemical, scent, and kinetic microactions taking place, it seemed particularly remarkable to think about how the beekeepers thought. Their human cognition was attuned to the life of the bees, networked to respond to their gestures, moving us away as they sensed it was time for their bees to rest. To curate, of course, means to care for, and the beekeepers certainly curate and care for and love the bees, cultivate the emerging system, protect it, and are crucially part of the system of the forest and trees and flowers. We could ask how Exomind changes with each new manifestation of the work, how the specificity of this location in Malta changes our understanding of the figure. How do the properties of this specific garden and forest feed this specific iteration of the work? We learned that the trees and the forest, was one of the beekeepers told us, are almost 1,000 years old, ancient. And one of the hosts told me that as a child they played on the carob trees, ancient trees, and made tree houses in them. It's a very old and symbolic and important tree in Malta. The beekeeper said that the air in this clearing was very still and calm and not near the ocean and wind. So for this statue to be successful, and for it is both a matter of chance and very careful placement. There aren't any hikers flooding through. So in general, aside from a bunch of art critics coming in the middle of the night, the one visitation, the pieces must be found and traveled to at a distance. So the bees and the trees have their own language, their own system of thinking, a kind of intelligence more akin to a rhizome or network. The beekeeper described how the queen communicates calm by rubbing the signal to others who carry it on to others, and that calms the whole hive down. And she does this until her time is up, and it's time for a new queen. So there's obviously a hierarchy here, and it's not a democracy. So political analogs of queens and workers still fade a bit as we see how information is distributed, flowing from body to body, node to node. We're also told this piece could have been set in Malta and 10 or so other locales, but that the Maltese bees are very happy in about 16 different places, and that here an ideal combination of seclusion, where the bees could stay in a place with a high improbability of being disturbed, made it work. So for it to work, the bees must flourish, and for it to work, people shouldn't be present as viewers all that much, only gently observing, understanding, and then moving away. So I'd written down before coming here what possible art critical response could there be to a work that has neither beginning nor end, remains indeterminate, and that's contingent on every level, that is using the site's processes and materials over a duration of time one can't assess. What role is critique even here for a work that's a perfected heterogeneous system, self-organized, indifferent to us? What kind of criteria can we use to assess it? It seems, after last night, to me that criticism also needs to move with the work, embedding itself as much in the conversation around it and the narrative around it, but also perhaps noting the effects on viewers, questioning our own positions in relation to it, and thinking about the people who are watching, how they react, and how they orient and turn away. So there's an answer to, I think in this experience, to the massive questions posed by the panel. How can we rethink our position in the world, and where should we look to for help? So I would suggest, one, that we could learn from the beekeeper as much as the bees, who are not extractive or disturbing, but in their practice completely relational, understanding that the bees needed to rest, and it came a time for us to go. They modeled, it seemed, how we might renegotiate our position in relation to other intelligences called non-human or other than human, or maybe some other term is what we need that doesn't put them in relation to not us or other than us. Our knowledge was ultimately mediated by the beekeepers, the translators of these other languages to our own. As beekeepers, we could perhaps better understand our positions in a network in which we aren't the center and shouldn't be the center, And it's this anthropocentric tendency that we take to ecology and to design, to art making, to technology that's clearly no longer serving us. Looking down on the world from above and from the top of a hill. And as we wound down into the garden, there was a really beautiful feeling of transition from the clear relationship with the object that's to be seen and judged, well lit, with a perfect perspective, to the feeling of being in the wrong place, unsure of one's knowledge, confused, uncomfortable, and at the risk of being exposed as a person learning just like everyone else. We could learn to become part of this exomind, learning the patterns and rhythms of the bees, hearing about them, renegotiating our assumptions, and becoming comfortable with what we can't see or perceive immediately, but have the humility to understand our place in this extended mind. We might extract metaphors from the emerging patterns of the honeycomb, the strategic communication of the queen to the workers, the phasing out of the Maltese native bees, more feisty than bees from everywhere, which was insisted on. And there are a lot of human analogs that we can make here. But in attuning to the radical indifference of these other intelligences, the externalized mind, there might be something here in letting it work on us. So the situation that Huyghe produces is one of uncertainty and doubt and a lack of knowledge, and ultimately a confrontation with our own lack of knowledge, which turns us to try and investigate some context. We have to talk to the beekeepers to understand this, and so the process of understanding what's going on becomes emergent as well. There's a surprise and chance of this encounter, the sight at night, seeing the aqueducts moving down to this space, which echo the beekeepers' voices, describing the systems still echoing in these old passages. So the understanding becomes not predetermined or captured by a perfect install shot. We could embrace becoming part of the network through our thinking through it, our production of culture, language, and artistic practice around it. But to do so effectively, to capture the contingency of the moment and its crisis or pressure, we must also be equally open to chance, risk, indeterminacy of the system itself. The more we can ground and unground our knowledge, undo roots and assumptions and positions, the more this practice of chance and risk in our own thinking we have, the more capable we might be to embrace some of the challenges of the moment. The analogs of the exomind to wider systems of networked intelligence are clear. The internet, rough forms of AI, are increasingly modeled on this distributed form. Cybernetics and computation and our relationships to technology, which I'm sure we'll go into in the Q&A, tend to reveal us as we are, always negotiating between the artificial and the real, the artificial and the natural. The complex system of the bees with the environment reveals itself as technological, as a technic system with complexity that emerges from its interdependence between the work and what is there. But the process of our thinking here in this room together about this system, rejecting universally valid or absolute knowledge assumptions, is itself a crucial complex system. So ultimately, to close, I take Exomind as a provocation to embrace how we program each other and ourselves. Each moment, we take in information, sift through, discard the ineffective, interpret, and make meaning, forming the basis of the next input through that process. And also might think of how quickly, through cultural and social programming, we dismiss those around us, assume they aren't useful or interesting. The bees' reciprocal relations and the beauty of their interdependence, it will take a lot of reprogramming to approximate this level of flexibility. But without revising those assumptions, reorienting our systems, editing and reprogramming ourselves, we cannot evolve. The bees and the trees will go on with or without us, but hopefully we can try and keep up and to keep watching them do so. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nora. There was a really beautiful expansion there. Our last speaker for our sessions is Nick Young, who I'm really excited to introduce. He's a lecturer of philosophy at the University of Malta. His areas of interest include 20th and 21st century continental philosophy, phenomenology, aesthetics, deconstruction, as well as various forms of new realism and materialism. He's also contributed to a number of publications related to philosophy and contemporary art, the most recent ones being Tree Presentations on Images and Things, and I Bear This Crest as a Crown of Thorns, a series of thoughts on Vince Briffa's Flower Heads. He currently acts as an advisor for Graham Harman's forthcoming work, which seeks to provide an elaborate synthesis and development of the ideas advanced by the author during the past 2 decades. Nikki, thank you so much.
I don't know if I should use, does this work? Or? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, good, great. So I'm interested in exploring the relationship between the work of Pierre Huyghe and what Graham Harman calls ontotaxonomy. Ontotaxonomy is basically a concept which Harman develops in 2016 in a couple of paragraphs in a book, but then kind of not abandons it, but doesn't talk about it too much. But it will definitely feature in the works that follow. So as Harman's work progresses, this concept will become more important. And I'm interested precisely in the way in which Exomind challenges what Harman calls ontotaxonomy, and in such a way that his work forces us to rethink not only our position in the world, but the very status of what we call the world as this homogeneous thing. So anyway, I'll begin by introducing the term. So what exactly is ontotaxonomy? It speaks about this tendency to, we have in philosophy, but not only, to posit an a priori difference between humans and everything else. So there is human on the one hand, and trillions of other entities which we hastily group as world, as if they are one thing. Now, ontotaxonomy is anthropocentric, of course, because it assumes that humans are so different in kind that they deserve a whole ontological category, that there's us and then there's everything else, and we are different in kind from everything else. Now, ontotaxonomy takes 2 forms. We can skip to the next one. We either sort of posit a difference between human versus the world. So there is this disjunction between human and the world. Of course, the most famous example in the history of philosophy is Descartes, who posited a difference between the mental and the physical, the mind and body, etc., etc., etc. But it can, of course, also take the form of a primary correlation. So we assume that human and world are not different, but they are 2 sides of something that is essentially one. Now, of course, even though there is a difference between saying that human and world are different and always already separate, nevertheless, both of them are ontotaxonomical insofar as they assume that there are 2 kinds of things, humans and world, and that these 2 things are either need to be bridged, or as they are always already bridged. Now, of course, Harman implicitly, even though he doesn't list this, proposes 3 solutions to ontotaxonomy, and I believe that these 3 solutions tie perfectly into the work of Pierre Huyghe, not only in Exomind, but also in other works, like, say, in UUmwelt, for example, or After a Life Ahead. So the first solution to ontotaxonomy, Harman says, is to assume a flat ontology. That is, to assume that there isn't a hierarchy between different kinds of objects, but that all objects exist primarily on the same level playing field. Of course, this doesn't mean that objects don't enter into relationships of power, but his point is that to enter into relationships of power, they must first of all exist. And none of them exist more or less than any other one. This is what he means by all objects are equally objects, essentially. The second solution he proposes is to discard or to ignore, to essentially refuse the difference between the natural substance, the one, and the artificial aggregate, the many. Harman's objects are both one and many. He says an object is essentially both something that is unified, by which he means it has a specific infrastructure, which we can't quite get at. But at the same time, it's made up of, no pun intended, swarms of subcomponents which are interacting between them. Of course, much like every object is both one and many, and every object is also composed of parts, parts can also generate a new object in this scenario. I mean, you can imagine, say, climate change as a hybrid of different interactions between objects, which are technological, artificial, natural, and so forth. The third solution he proposes is to see objects as essentially entangled, but not reciprocal. So what he means by this is that objects are entwined with other objects in such a way that it is impossible to take a distance from them. We are entwined with the world and with objects, and the objects are entwined with one another. Of course, objects also offer imperatives to us. So when we think of ethics, for instance, we tend to think of ethics as a relationship between two people. But of course, in some sense, the door commands me to move in a certain way, and so forth. So in a sense, this is a relationship which is ethical in some sense, or driven by imperatives. Yes, another, now what I mean by non-reciprocity is that, not every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That I may have a relationship to an object, but the object couldn't care less about me in return. Say, of course, the Earth has a relationship with the sun in some way, but the sun hardly cares for whether the Earth revolves around it or not. Of course, all these 3 points, namely the distinction between the one and the many, the flat ontology, and so forth, tie directly into Pierre Huyghe's work. Because, of course, in relation to flat ontology, Pierre Huyghe's work is composed of a multitude of different objects. It's very difficult to tell exactly what kind of object is composed of. Technological ones, natural ones, cultural ones, human, non-human. It's very difficult to tell where exactly, what kind of thing it is, if we're going to classify things in that manner. Of course, in relation to the distinction between the one and the many, you can see the object as one thing, but also composed of many, many other things. And of course, in relation to the last point, that they're entangled but non-reciprocal. Of course, the sculpture is entangled with the environment around it and with the objects in its vicinity, but that doesn't mean that they automatically enter into relation. Say the bee has a relationship with the flower, and this relationship exists in a very different manner to the way in which the bee has a relationship with the stone, if it even has one.
We can maybe have 1 or 2 questions. We thought with Rebecca to all the speakers. I mean, one thing I was thinking, listening to all your great contribution, is, when we think about Glissant, he always said that we need sort of theory as a toolbox. It has to be a toolbox to do things. And you've all told us amazing ideas, amazing, visions. And I think in a very pragmatic way, I wanted to maybe ask you all how we can bring that all back to the museum. Because of course, it's a very fascinating, situation here in Malta, because this is all part of a generative process. Last year's wonderful Ugo Rondinone, this year's piece we are celebrating today. It's a generative moment towards an art institution, a very important art institution, which is born here on the island. It will be the first contemporary art museum to basically open. So, thinking about this idea that we talk about living organisms, thinking about this idea also that everything we've heard today is really the opposite of event culture, of as Pierre says, the hysteria of event culture, given the fact that exhibitions are maybe not an obsolete format, but at least a format to be always questioned. And in a way, artists at the moment think, really beyond exhibitions. That, of course, has implications for what the institution of the future will be. So I wanted to ask you all to maybe tell us what we can learn from that, for a museum, for the 21st century, and how can we do in this, age, an institution which is not basic, which is more sustained, which is about sustainability, which has other time horizons. Maybe it has also to do with being slower, I was thinking. Maybe it's about, as Ben Vickers always says, our CTO, the artist and CTO of the Serpentine, he always says it's about slow programming. The future is slow programming. But I'm not sure, maybe you agree or disagree. I don't know who wants to start.
I think it's a really great question to try to imagine how should be the institution to welcome these new mediums of artworks. Some things that sometime I had in mind was the capability of an architecture also to transform itself, but that's not new. Like already maybe Centre Pompidou in France has modular walls, but what about just trying to think about possibilities of opening and closing towards the exterior? Just the idea of porousness that's maybe contrary to the White Cube, which is this institution that has arrived in order to exhibit an artwork, maybe should be rethought. And we could take cues on, yes, this idea of porosity, entanglement, which are really abstract, but I guess that architects are working on that more than me. But how to think about, walls that will change, the possibilities of getting in and out, having relations with the exterior. But that, I guess, would be a problem for health department, which you said, Rebecca, was already a problem when you introduce flies inside an institution. So, yes, maybe that's it. These clues.
Yeah, and it can, of course, also be then applied, to the city, because the porousness and entanglement means also that maybe the museum, goes, as Arthur Schaeffer told us when he did the Serpentine show, the museum goes into the city and brings the city into the museum. So I think it's a very interesting point.
It's actually something very interesting you've said about slowness, because the problem which philosophy is facing nowadays, and of course it's the same thing in art, is that both of them are disciplines which are essentially slow in the sense that it takes a lot of time, there's a lot of investment in thinking, very, very slow thinking. And the problem is that it's just the way the world is nowadays, it's just too fast. So of course there's this tension between what art and philosophy do and with the way the world is, or with the way the times are. And I think somehow the future of the museum would have to figure out ways in which we can allow people to experience slowness, I think.
Wonderful. A museum for the 21st century, which allows us to experience slowness. Thank you.
Well, it turns out that speed is a big problem in technology and technological design as well. And I think, in terms of how this relates to the museum, I think there's a statistic about how many people who live in New York City never step into a museum, whether the programming is free or not. Because it isn't just about the space being open, it's whether people feel they can enter to begin with. And so, looking at this sculpture and hearing the discussions today, I think a lot about a museum as a space of maintenance and care. And in curating this exhibition, we're 20 days from install, the most of the work happens through the relationship with the staff, with visitor experience, with the labor that goes into the maintenance of artwork, which is all of the work that happens beyond the event. So I think the more that curation starts to focus on these diverse perspectives, on editing, on decreasing the emphasis on one star or a star kind of culture, and one perspective having the kind of final say on what the reality of the world is, you'll invite more people in because they can feel part and they can feel like it's not a top-down perspective. It's a really simple answer, but yeah.
Yeah, that's another very important point. The other day, a taxi driver dropped me in Kensington Gardens. At the Serpentine, I came back from a trip super early, at 6 a.m. or something, and I went to the office. And obviously the driver assumed that I wouldn't visit the exhibition at 6 a.m., so he assumed I would work there. So he said he always wanted to talk to someone who works at the Serpentine and tell me the story of of his daughter. They went on a walk in the park and on a Sunday, and suddenly the daughter ran into the pavilion. And had an epiphany and sort of decided to become an architect. So he wanted to thank us. And but that's only the first part of the story. What relates to your point is the second part of the story. I then said, have you also visited our exhibitions? Because of course we have free admission. And he said, no, never would I, never. And so I said, but why? And it's free admission. And he said, no, because I believe profound. I've never been in my life in a museum. And I said, why? He said, I believe that museums are not for people like me. So it's these thresholds. So to kind of remove that, and I think that's your point, right? Is very urgent. Emanuele?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a huge question. I don't know if I have a right answer, but I would say two things. The one on time, the other one on exhibition. About time, I do not think that we can or we should oppose to the fast rhythm, the idea of slow. There are things that has to be fast, and there are things that has to be slow. I mean, and it's stupid to oppose the one and the other. The question is the question of rhythm. Life is what is important in life is not. I mean, if everything is life would be slow, that would be so boring. So it's no. It's the question is the question of rhythm, and the question is also a question of power. Things last. I mean, the question is not, or the problem is not that things have to be slow. The question is that things has to last much more than a week or 2 weeks. Sometimes, not always, sometimes. But art should perhaps rethink, or the artwork should rethink the rhythm, not oppose a slow way of living to a fast way of living. And the second question, the second problem is about exhibition. I would say that if exhibition is now problematic, it's not because we are thinking that it's not a good mean of thinking or a good way of doing stuff. Because in a way, through Facebook, life has become permanent exhibition, a permanent museums. I mean, we are permanently showing our life as a sort of, we became a sort of museum, individual museums of ourselves. So we need exhibitions. The problem is that museums embody, in a way, a very old idea of exhibition. They are, in comparison to Facebook or to Instagram, so in a way, so stupid. So in a way, because I can doing an exhibition of my life in 2 seconds, and so we have to rethink this the exhibitions in a much more powerful way, and not get rid of exhibitions. And we have to enlarge exhibitions, since the city itself, the museum must coincide with the city itself. It makes no more sense to think of museum as a part of the city. So in a way, the curator must sit at the administration of a city. Each city has to be an open-air museum, in a way, so of the public life of the city.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And of course, there are interesting resonances here with a very old idea, which is actually a very new idea of Cedric Price and John Littlewood, when they wanted to do the Fun Palace in the early 60s, which was an institution which had fast lanes and slow lanes, and in a way would be porous and connect to the city. So in many things I hear from what you say, kind of that idea of the Fun Palace seems to resonate. Simone?
I think that, having heard everybody, and I was particularly, you anticipated me when you were relating the story about the taxi driver who feels that an art museum or an art gallery is not a place where he could go. Because I think this is exactly what an art museum shouldn't be, and all museums really. It shouldn't be elitist at all. It should be, art is always an expression, a human expression. It should be accessible to all. And I think there's a huge loss if it's only accessible to a certain category of people. Because art is primarily an empowerment tool. It has been used to portray protests, it has been used to depict the situation, it has been used to pass on a message when sometimes it was not possible, there was no freedom of expression to do so. And I think going back also to the Exomind sculpture, it is so impressively accurate at depicting the state of human beings at the moment in their overwhelming barrage of information, and at the same time this sense of loss as to where they need to go and how they fit in, and that the awareness that they are just a part of a bigger circle, and the humility to accept that, and the responsibility to show their responsibility that they have to respect this balance in nature, being at the moment at the helm, in the driving seat. I think any museum which, like the Serpentine Galleries, which is already accessible to all because it is free, but it may be, if there is the need to overcome the fear of certain people to enter into an art gallery because they will feel they don't know what it's all about, or they feel that it's not a place where they should be. This should be, I think, exhibitions like this encourage to do away with this kind of barrier. And last but not least, I think museums, looking back at, for example, something which is very Mediterranean, although it exists everywhere, it has existed everywhere, the street theater, Commedia dell'arte, the Punch and Judy shows, which are an example of the Commedia dell'arte, were extremely influential in turning the tide of human thinking, leading to revolutions, leading to challenges to the authorities that were misbehaving. It was a time when there was no freedom of expression, especially for the common people. And passing on the message through theater, certain thoughts and certain ways of thinking managed to influence the masses, the civilian population. And this is what we're seeing today, especially with respect to environment protection, on the need to balance out our use of resources with socio-economic well-being. I think the empowerment to the civilian from art has to be supportive in this process which we are witnessing in this day and age. Thank you.
No, thank you for this great contribution. And I think, of course, one thing which came to my mind, listening to you and this idea of the empowerment also, it's of course very interesting that where that does happen is with public art, because people actually stumble upon it, and that's the thing we observe at the Serpentine when we put sculpture into the park, or when we put the pavilion into the park. The taxi driver story is that, is somebody stumbles upon it by chance and then has a transformative experience. Now it's very interesting that very often these two things are divided. You've got public art organizations who place public sculptures around, and then you have museums. What I was actually thinking today for the first time when I, listening to you all, is that maybe the problem is that should not be separated, because it's so interesting that the museum here, in its prefiguration, decided to do these public art projects with Hugo, with Pierre, where basically visitors can, or the city can encounter the art in unexpected ways. And that, of course, is something which could be interesting for any museum in the world to think about. What does it mean to have a very consequent public art program in the city related to the exhibitions which happen in the museum? And that somehow seems to be maybe an option. Just came to my mind. Mantia?
I actually want to expand on the anecdote by adding another anecdote to the anecdote. David Hammons always says that the meaning of art, or the role of art, is to disturb the peace. That art disturbed the peace. And last week, I was sitting at Café de Dôme with him, and we're looking at La Rotonde, and then there are those long buses that pass by all the time, and then pedestrians are crossing, and all these things are happening. And suddenly, the wind blew a big piece of plastic in the middle of the street, and then people kept going around it. He said, "That's art right there." People kept going around it and kept going around it, and at some point, a black woman was passing. She took the plastic and got it out of the way. And he said, "She's human. She's not an artist. She should have left that piece of plastic right there and let people go around it." He said, "That's art." And then he began to say, because you have to expand the meaning of what is art. And as you expand the meaning of what is art, you have to expand what is going in the museum, what is going to be hung in the museum. And once, at least to him, and you know him, that's why he would speak like this, he said once he put it in the museum, then it become classical. It become classical, and then you have to create what he called the new Baroque, Glissant called the new Baroque. You have to create a new Baroque again. So the art has to be reinvented. So we're gonna go around a lot, this sculpture, until it become classical. That's the way he was defining art for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mantia. What more wonderful way of concluding this first round. The exhibition of Pierre really created a new degree of porousness, and now we're going to have next year a show of Dominique Gonzalez-Förster, which will, go yet in another way, in a transformative way, and bring actually the institution completely into the park, so that you will actually, the inside-outside will be blurred, and you all of a sudden will have another form of entanglement. And then we have Arthur Jafa, who comes to the Serpentine and says, what does it mean that you ask all the people to come to Kensington Garden? You need to go to all the boroughs outside London. You need to go to the people. You need to bring art into society. And that, of course, is something John Latham always said, with Barbara Stevini. They always said, we need to bring art into society. And that's why every corporation, every company, and every government should have an artist on the board, which is something we passionately believe in. So we're incredibly grateful, Rebecca, Natalia, and I, and everybody at the Serpentine, to our wonderful speakers, to Pierre. I also wanted to say that we are very grateful to Pierre Huyghe's amazing team, who is here, Anne Stan and Sarah Simon and Anne-Sophie Tisserand. A big round of applause to them. And we are, of course, very grateful also to Chantal Cruzel's team, who is here. A big round of applause to them. And again, I want to reiterate how grateful we are to MICAS and for the amazing collaboration, and ask you all again to give a very big round of applause to our amazing speakers, to Emanuele, to Nora, to Nikki, to Flora, to Simone, to Mantia. Thank you so much.